Let's consider the cost of developing a software system. We will know that these are some of the phases of the software lifecycle that we need to go through when developing a software system. That is analysis, design, coding, testing. And all of these phases will be supported by appropriate documentation. Of course, all of the employees of the software house will have to be paid, and the software house company will have overheads to run the business, and all of this forms the cost of all of the phases you're looking at here. Now, when the software system is complete and deployed, which means it's given over to the stakeholders, the customers who wanted the software system, we move into the maintenance phase. And the maintenance phase has to ensure that the software keeps on working throughout the lifetime of the use of the software by the customer. And of course, people will be employed during the maintenance phase for the software product that's been produced for the stakeholder. For argument's sake, let's say that the software system took 12 months to develop, and after 12 months, the product is given over to the customer and we enter the maintenance phase. We'll work on the assumption that the software handed over to the customer is going to be used for at least 5 years, and we will need to ensure that it's kept working during the maintenance phase for that 5-year period, which will involve things like possible updates to the system. So it is legitimate to ask, what's the cost of the software with a long life? Now that means from the moment you started the analysis through to when the customer is most probably going to finish using the software. So we said it took 12 months to develop the software, and then we had to support it in the maintenance phase for 5 years. So we need to consider the overall cost of this. For lots of projects, it is the case that the maintenance phase, in terms of how much money is spent by the software house to keep the software working, can actually be greater than the 12 months it took to develop the software in the first instance. It needs to be appreciated that the personnel involved during the maintenance phase are heavily reliant upon the documentation produced during these phases when the software was being built. Consequently, the documentation has to be accurate, and version control of all of the documentation is key to good software engineering practice. And those responsible for the maintenance phase, if they fix a bug, they do not just fix the code, they have to ensure that all of the artifacts that were produced during the phases here are updated as well, to ensure any future maintenance again can rely upon the documentation being up to date. I would like to emphasize that during the maintenance phase, it's not just the case of updating the software, writing new lines of code to get the system changed to the requirement that's come to light, or to fix a bug. The personnel involved during the maintenance phase have a responsibility for the updating of all of the documentation that was produced during the development of the software. In other words, during analysis, design, coding, and testing. This is to ensure full compatibility between the software and the documentation, because the maintenance personnel are guided by the documentation. So we can't have a situation where the documentation doesn't reflect the software system. Consequently, if the software is being altered over time, the documentation also has to alter to continually match the software system that is still the responsibility of the software house. This is why during the software lifecycle, maintenance can cost more than development, whether development is the analysis, design, implementation, in other words, coding, and testing phases.